strategy in many ways, an assumption that, a specific way of doing things is going to lead to better outcomes, right? So if you don't have that part, then you're really screwed up, right? And I think most of the time, this is where you have the weakest link.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
This is the Product Agility Podcast, as you may have ascertained from the introduction. Thank you to all our returning listeners, and hello to new listeners. I believe we're getting lots of new listeners now. And new listeners and old listeners alike, you are in for a treat. Because today, we have a seasoned technology leader, somebody who is as passionate about strategy as I am. And we're going to be talking today about a really interesting new concept that Seb, who is on the episode with me today, mentioned at the beginning of the call. He told me that OKRs are dead. Just watching Fear for his reaction to that. He didn't actually tell me OKRs are dead, but you know what? They may as well be in many organisations, and we're going to unpick this over the next 45 minutes. But before we do, I wanted you all to have a little bit of an introduction as to who Seb is. And Seb is somebody that I met at Productize, actually, in Lisbon. And it's wonderful to have him on for a full episode. So Seb, welcome to the Product Agility Podcast. Would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Thank you. No, it'd be a pleasure. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. I spent the last 20 years across technology and product mostly, but also the roles across operations and the business. I've done many different industries and types of companies. So I think that's, something that is quite unusual these days, where people tend to focus on the same vertical for a long time. I've been in product leadership for the last 10 years, give or take. And more recently, I've taken on the challenge of starting my own company called Stratify as a way to help SaaS companies do better with their strategy. Hence the passion behind it for strategy, OKRs, and roadmaps and everything related.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to this episode. I'm feeling a little bit feisty today. This will be the second episode of 2025.
Bring it on.
To check what year it was then. So we're starting off strong. But Seb, you're also working on a prototype, aren't you, at the moment as well? You're getting your hands dirty and building something.
Correct. And it's good to be back to the roots in many ways, So, I mean, a product is an end-to-end kind of endeavor, right? It starts with the code. It's about, the go-to-market on top of that, and ultimately, having the right contact and engagement with the customer. So got to the point where I had to, in a way, develop all the skills to do everything else but the code, because I haven't coded in 20 years. So it was a bit daunting to kind of face maybe having to go back to doing that. But, luckily for me, a lot of the technology has evolved, right? There's a lot of no-code, low-code tools. The integrations with APIs is much easier than ever was. And, the AI is also helping a lot in many ways. So it's easier to configure agents and a lot of things by yourself. So, still very early days, but exciting to see how, that turns out.
Nice. Well, I can't wait to hear how it turns out. This year will be the year that I finally get my product out as well. So maybe we can do an episode about how well we're doing, about how wildly successful both of our products are proving to be, and all the money we've raised through funding. That'd be a really nice episode. We'll book that in for September, perhaps, when it's all a reality. So,
definitely happy to.
Have you set yourself any OKRs for what you're doing with your product?
Well, good question. The product is meant to be a lot more than just OKRs. I think, in many companies, strategy, if you think about it that way, is brought down to very few things. And I think OKRs are the more obvious kind of emanation of strategy in many ways. The rest is mostly dusty documents. And so long story short, I'm dogfooding my own product, right? So everything I'm doing to create the company in terms of setting the vision, setting the strategy, defining the market, all the things that you actually really need to do in order to do a good job at strategy, whatever that means, is in the product. And so I'm definitely using that, right? And obviously as part of that, what comes out of it is a roadmap, is a set of objectives and goals, OKRs, call them whatever you want. But yeah.
Nice. It was good to hear. It's good to hear eating your own dog food. as they
Yes.
say. Practicing what you preach, I suppose, is to be less gross.
Indeed. Consistency is key.
Exactly. So I mentioned at the top that OKRs are dead. OKR has been around for 20 plus years, and yet consistently people seem to struggle to have them have the effect that they would like. Big organizations, small organizations, I don't think anyone is immune from doing them in a shit way. I say that inflammatory, maybe not in a shit way, but doing them in such a way that does not deliver upon the promise of them. As I said, from your vast experience and from the stories and tales from being in the trenches working with OKRs, like, why do you think that OKRs are so difficult to really live up to the promise?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is the word you use, right? Difficult. Because if anything, the promise of the OKRs was very much based on that, proposition that they were super simple, right? There was this sort of beauty about the OKRs, which is they are very simple. It's only two key objects that are related to each other, like two halves of the same coin. You have objectives and key results, and they just cascade, and it's universal. I mean, at the heart of it, this is what it is, right? And so it's kind of surprising that 20 years later, we would still find, and I mean, the wider we, like many people would find the OKR still very difficult, right? If it's that simple to start with, how can it ever be difficult? And I think, the reason between those two statements is the fact that, they are falsely simple, right? The reality is, if you think about the vocabulary that is used, like an objective, what is it? Everybody has their own definition of what an objective is. If you listen to a zillion videos, you realize that everybody has their own take on what the word means. And then you have key results, and the same thing happens all over again, right? So what happens, I think, for many people is, they get introduced to the methodology, they watch the video, they read the book, maybe, right? And the problem is, okay, it seems all very simple when you have an example, right? But the problem is like, if something is so simple, but you have to continuously learn by example, it feels like it's somehow you're not really understanding deep down what it's about, right? It's almost like someone teaches you to do additions, you can repeat it, but then you make the occasional mistake because you just don't quite really get how it's supposed to unfold. But I think there's a bit of that with the OKRs, where still today people not quite sure exactly how to select an objective, the relationship between higher level and lower level objectives, and also more widely how all these things connect, right? I think part of the problem with OKRs is that now, like they're not so easily connected to roadmap, to strategy, or, retreats, or whatever exercise you're doing around strategy, right? And that disconnection between the OKRs and the rest of the reality of strategy and the business means that it kind of becomes its own island, right? You have this island called OKRs, and the teams are supposed to do them. And then when they have to do it for their own teams, it's not quite clear how it's supposed to do or to go. And the reality is, in most companies, you might have a few people who are very well versed with OKRs, but not everybody, right? And I think that's that's the macro pattern that's been happening over the last 20 years, is like OKRs came to the forefront, and a lot of people got really excited, right? It's like, as you were saying, the promise, like if you buy into OKRs and you roll them out, you're going to be the next Google, right? Like back to the book. And the reality is, like, it's very different. There's many reasons for it, but the problem is that, unlike what it was 20 years ago, where people were very much at the sort of in the golden age of strategy, right? You had KPMG and all these companies coming. You had people like Andy Grove, were like on top of their own previous 20 years of really understanding how a company works and everything, and Porter and all these things. The thing is, 20 years later, the only thing that most people understand about strategy is just OKRs. And so it's that tiny island in the middle of everything that, is actually not as simple as it was sold to you. And then magically that's supposed to solve all the problems in the company, from a strategic point of view. And I think that's what people are left with in many ways.
No, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I like what you were saying, that OKRs are sold in this kind of simplicity premise, but they are very simple. But then you kind of then go on to make the point very rightly that if you go back and you look at a lot of the experts who have succeeded running businesses, who then perhaps used OKRs because they were successful business people, then for them to set an objective, a short-term or a medium-term objective, and some key results, wasn't as difficult for people who haven't got the understanding of why their business exists, where their business is going, how are we looking to achieve the goals that are set out to do at a longer level, what problems are they looking to solve in the immediate future. And I think that's then when it breaks down. So when OKRs are sold / marketed or adopted, however they are introduced, as this island, which is then divorced from everything, and OKRs become the strategy. I think that's when you'll see that actually OKRs may as well be killed, may as well die, because I don't think that you can have a good OKR if you haven't got a strategy which you understand.
Correct. And I think this is the main challenge, right? You hear a lot of fairly bold statements about OKRs, whether they're useful, not useful, whether you should adopt them or not, or, stay away from them and everything. But yeah, at the heart of it, if you don't really understand them well enough, and if you don't have the, all the other things that need to connect to it well in place, you're going to struggle. And the thing is, what happens also the other way around is you have a lot of people who don't necessarily need to understand OKRs or understand them vaguely, but actually have a more intuitive, natural understanding of strategy or, from experience or whatnot. And so they will be able to formulate things the right way, and suddenly, adhering to the formalism of the OKRs is just like a nice to have, but it's not necessarily a challenge for them to formulate the strategy. The problem is that works well enough when you are a founder or a leader and you have that kind of experience, or you've had the training somehow and enough, iterations to really understand how it works. The problem is most of the time you're trying to cascade that to a whole organization who doesn't have that background, doesn't have that understanding. And so the only thing you really give them is the OKRs. So they don't have that experience to kind of connect it to, right? And really understand, okay, this is what you want me to do through the methodology of OKRs, right? It's just they give them a framework, almost like a methodology, and now make it work somehow magically, right? And that takes a long time for people to actually understand how to roll it out, how to actually really write things and craft them the right way, just as a way to see also all the dark patterns of what it is when you write them the right way or when you don't write them the right way. And then there's plenty of other things that go into that. For example, like a key thing in OKRs in many ways has been as part of the culture, I would say, around OKRs is to set very ambitious targets. The target is the objective, is the key result. That's one thing. But, you get to the point where people are over ambitious. And so those OKRs that are meant to be like, oh, your 100% is actually more like 150%. So if you only do 70%, it's kind of good. All these things are actually confusing people, right? It's because they want to live in a world of certainty. And I think that's also another link to the strategy, which is strategy as an inherent part of, something you can't control, right? Because the outcome you're seeking is on the market, right? You want users to come, but you have no real way of forcing them to come, right? So your strategy has this built-in uncertainty, and people are not, comfortable with that. So you have to really place the uncertainty where it lives. But for everything else, you have to be very clear about what it is that you expect and how it's supposed to work. And if you're looking at a roadmap document, if you're looking at a set of OKRs, if you're looking at, a vision document, whatever it might be, then it should be very clear how those things tie together. And I think that's what I mean by it's not as simple as it seems, because if you look at just the connection between the vision and the strategy, right? Everybody wants to have an ambitious strategy. That's one thing. And if it's just that, that's a bit of a cop-out in many ways. But more importantly, you want a vision that will drive your strategy, right? How do you go from one to the other? Right? And that's what's interesting, because when I do, conferences and I do workshops and I do consulting, a lot of people still come back to me and say, well, we have OKRs, but we don't have a strategy, or we have a strategy, but we have no vision. Right? So they talk about the same kind of components of the strategic exercise in the wider sense of the term, but those things are not connected. Right? So you have all those different layers that play against people. And the reality of companies as well is that I personally believe that, we don't invest enough in strategy. And I mean that in terms of developing people. And this is kind of what I'm trying to solve in many ways, because the moment you say that people of all levels do OKRs, what you're really saying to them is they're doing strategy. And yet, if you ask leaders, or, most of the time leaders, but, people in general, they would say, oh no, the strategy is something that happens in the leadership team. What they refer to is the company strategy, right? But if you think about the product, right, there is a product strategy, there is a product vision, right? So all these things are still connected, right? So, and if you cascade that all the way down, it means that also product teams, any other team in the business for that matter, does strategy, right? They have a set of problems, like, whether it's needs, goals, they have a market in many ways, right? Like they're trying to solve that, and they have an optimization problem to solve for. The strategy is a way to solve that optimization problem. So I think there is also a sort of cultural disconnect in many ways when, you are really not really properly leveraging 90% of the organization. And what happens when you don't do that is that people not really familiar with strategy when they start at the bottom level, and they hope that one day they'll get in the leadership team, and then, the strategy will be magic, right? Like it would be all very clear. And the reality is, like, and I've done that myself, you get there, it's not the case, right? Like the quality of the conversations, of the strategy conversations, I think is, not where it needs to be at all levels. And I think that's the key thing. I would prefer to, I'm dreaming of a time where people from the first day in their career, do strategy, like whatever it is that they do when they say, I want to set my objectives, I want to have, create a roadmap, just as a product person, a developer, whatever, they understand, they have the awareness that they're doing strategy. Right? And then they grow into their roles and into the ranks, doing strategy continuously as part of their thinking, their operational thinking, if you think about, the technical skill. So that by the time they get into leadership team, then they have that understanding.
So I think it's wise for us to spend some time talking about, really what is strategy, or how do we describe strategy? Because you mentioned a second ago that a strategy is a way to solve an optimization problem, which I thought was nice. And I think maybe we could spend some time understanding it really specifically, like what is strategy, because I think there are different, obviously you were saying about having everyone think strategically, and that's great, but what does that even mean? What is that strategic thinking mindset? If you were to say to somebody, that's a really good strategy, like what are you seeing in front of you which is saying that is a good, well understood, clearly articulated strategy which is feasible? Like what's the checklist for you for what makes a strategy?
Yeah, I think so. To start with, it's true that the word strategy is used in many different circumstances. And actually the reality is, like, it's not that all of them are wrong bar one, right? Like there is multiple occasions where you use strategy for slightly different things, but actually all correct in many ways, right? So that's kind of like, that doesn't really help, the confusion, because people just like when there is just one answer to the question kind of thing, right? But I think what I meant by the optimization problem is, if you think about, even when you do a vision, right? What you're really saying is you start with a problem, right? There is a problem somewhere. And fundamentally, what you want as a company is to solve that problem, right? What you're really saying is the first strategy you put in place is actually creating the company. And the first objective you have is to solve that problem, right? Now, the reality is, like, you have that. It's like, okay, great. But, what does it mean to create a company, right? Well, what are the objectives for the company? At a high level, you can think that one is a notion of product to market fit, right? That's the closest proxy you have to solving the problem. Then, you have a scalable organization in many different ways, right? Like, your operations are good. And then you have a sort of line of sight to the future, right? Those are typically the key dimensions, right? And when you think about it that way, then the strategy is always a way to fulfill a higher level objective, right? Whether it's solving the customer problem, whether it's achieving a specific goal regarding product to market fit or efficiencies or whatnot, there is that notion of higher level goal, right? This is like, when I use examples around Napoleon or the Le Mans race, what you want is winning the race. What you want is winning the battle. All right. So it does start with a notion objective, but then the real question becomes the how. Right. So the how is fundamentally what people would define as the strategy, right? So if you think about your vision, you want to achieve that, those objectives of success of solving the problem and everything, but then you would have to go through missions. Like, what are the different stages that it will take? So it's that, that's when people say a coherent set of actions, right? But obviously you're not just doing that, to go from A to B. So today there is a problem. What I want to go is B to get to a position where there is a solution in place and I've resolved the problem. That's fundamentally what you're trying to do. And so the strategy is that, change mechanism from A to B. Now, you're not doing that completely in isolation, right? You have constraints, right? So you're going to do something in the hope of fulfilling your goal, right? But you're going to have to do it under specific constraints, right? From your environment, from your capabilities, budget, whatnot. And then you're going to have to manage risks. And so for me, this is why, when I think about the strategy, I mean that this is a way to fulfill higher level objectives through your existing or to become, new capabilities, and then, you have to set the objectives for how those strategies will convert into something very tangible, and then you just have to sequence it. And I know it sounds simple, but if you think about it, in many different ways, we already have the keys to that through a traditional roadmap. Right. And a lot of the talks I'm doing at the moment are very much around like, how do you connect OKR, strategy, and roadmap? Right. And actually, on one slide, you can see everything. If you imagine that one slide where at the very top you'd have the high level objectives you want to solve, right? The sort of the headers of your swim lanes are the strategies that you're deploying. There are different kind of mechanisms of creating value, right? So when you have a product strategy, right, which could be the title of your slide, the objectives of your product strategy is to fulfill the specific objectives, right? And the way you're going to do it is, for example, having a combination of an app, of integrations, of APIs. Right? A lot of the time, people in roadmaps call them themes. Oh, it's the header, it's the theme. It's not that. It's actually a strategy. That's the name of your strategy. Right? The product strategy is a combination of your app strategy, your integration strategy, and your API strategy. Right? And each of the swim lanes, when you see what happens inside of the swim lanes, you're basically, creating objectives, right? The objective is basically saying, if I have a strategy like an app, that app could take a zillion different shapes. But you have to really choose the one shape you want for that app. You want to choose which user is going to be targeting. So I'm not sure if I'm being, super clear, because it's very visual. And I think this was part of also like, people are visual people. And so trying to explain with words, I'm doing what I don't want to be doing, right? Like I'm basically trying to explain with words that people don't connect easily in their heads, something that is both simple and complicated. And I think this is why I wanted to build a product, right? Because the product is a way for people to understand things, because you can then break it down into, different bits and bobs that you can understand piecemeal, but then you can connect them all back together. Right? So you have your OKRs, you have your roadmap, and you have your strategy all in one place.
I wonder, is that for many organizations, they struggle with this all because they overcomplicate it. And historically, they have overcomplicated things. So when you look at a way that an organization is structured, and let's say that there is lots of kind of functional silos, and there are many, many layers of reporting, and there's a huge amount of distance from the people who are making the changes to the product and the market and that market feedback. But I don't think OKRs will ever really deliver what they're supposed to, even if there is an alignment on a problem and say everyone thinks strategically, because by the time you get down to that lower level, you're so divorced from the reality. The types of problems which you are trying to solve at that lower level, they're probably not aligned to the greater organizational purpose, and you're dealing with much, much pain. Probably because of dependencies and having to wait for people, and because of ambiguity, and because of the fact it takes so long to get stuff out. Is that I wonder, when organizations do get really overly complicated, that then OKRs just don't stand a chance. And I think that, if you want to listen to what you're saying, and I think about my own experience too, using OKRs is great when you can align people against that problem, and when that line of sight to solving the problem is as clear and as short as possible. The longer that line becomes, and the more different functional departments that goes through, the harder it's going to be to allow people to have to come up with an OKR, to come up with a meaningful objective, which is going to really solve the problem. So my question to you is that if we then just kind of go back then to the top and say, yes, it is about solving a problem, how do you help people figure out at that higher level what is the problem that's worth solving?
So, good question. I think the first thing is, maybe going one step back is, every team, and this is where I don't believe that OKRs are hard, even if you're at the bottom of the organization. It puts a lot more pressure on making sure that the cascade happens, right? But locally, I think you can always do a good job. And I think doing a good job starts with just defining your scope, right? When you say your team, a team is basically an emanation of the strategy. Right? You have a partnership team because you have a partnership strategy, not the other way around. Right? So if you are, for example, if you're the team in charge of a specific product, what is your scope, right? Like, what is that boundary that defines the inside and the outside, right? You're on the inside as the team, right? You have specific capabilities. And then there is the outside, right? And the outside is potentially the rest of your organization, but it's also the user, right? So the moment you say the user, in many different ways, you have also shortened the distance, right? Because you are right against the market.
Mm-hmm.
So although if you look at the organization, you're a million miles away. If you look at the actual value chain, a product team is directly in contact with the customer and therefore the market and therefore the value.
Yeah, which is great. So you said something really interesting a second ago. You said lots of interesting things. But one thing that really piqued my interest. You said you got a partnership team because you have a partnership strategy. And do you know what? I think that's part of the problem.
It is definitely.
I think that a lot of the time there are teams are created not because there is a strategic problem to solve, but because it's the easiest way for people to solve something that's causing them pain, or an easiest way for them to manage the pieces. So then you have teams that shouldn't need to exist in the way that they exist. So they get given an opportunity to write an OKR, and they don't know what problem to solve, or they're not solving problems that are worthwhile. It's, for example, if you ended up with a low-level team, and they were nowhere near a product team, and it's just something around a particular, I don't know, say an API, right? And the APIs aren't really a business; it's just a delivery channel. And you're saying, "Don't come up with an OKR. What would be a good OKR for an API team?" Like, they're going to solve the things that are causing them pain. There is no strategy around API. There's strategy around other pieces, but they weren't created because there was a strategy. They were created because someone thought it's easier for us to manage this API stuff if they're in a separate team.
Well, yeah, but that's because it was not explicitly declared, right? But you have an app product because you have an app strategy. It's the same thing in the product world, right? So if I take, like, a lot of people come to me actually for those very same questions, right? Like, for example, you have a platform team or an API team or something like that. So the platform team feels very indirect, right? Like, they feel almost like perpendicular to the value stream aligned kind of teams or working towards the user, but it's all relative, right? So relatively to you, if you're a platform team that, for example, provides, AI tools to a main group of people to actually build the pipelines or whatever functionality is being delivered directly to the customers, right? Your user is those teams. So your outside is those guys, right? So the moment it's almost like, if you go sideways into those guys and then you kind of go vertical towards the customer. But if you unfold it from your point of view, your value chain is very simple, right? Like, you have your own scope, which is like the tools that you provide. Your user is the other teams within the sort of, below the APIs kind of group. And those guys will then be used, through the sort of front end teams and ultimately to the user. So whatever it is that you are doing is indirectly, but very much, still quite directly connected to whatever the user is going to experience, right? If your module for AI is crap, the user experience is going to be bad as well. So you define everything relatively to your own scope. This is the way to, create empowerment, as well as, having clear definitions of, again, why you exist, right? Like, the moment you empower a team, and I think that's where empowerment should really come from. Like, you basically saying, look, we need to do something around that, right? There's that strategy. You guys are in charge of doing that. And the point is then you have to set it up for success by connecting it the right way to the other team, so people have an understanding of how they add value.
So let's talk about the obvious stuff, Seb, right? Because before we started recording, in fact, we were talking, I was having a rant about Mike Kagan and marketing techniques and luring people in by saying inflammatory statements like OKRs are dead just to get them to listen to you, or whatever it might be. Okay. And we said, but sometimes I said, there's some stuff which is really just quite obvious. And we said, well, maybe it isn't obvious for everyone. And I think this is part of the challenge, right? Is that what you say there, I totally understand. And it's a true statement in respect that, I'm connected to you. You're touching the ground. You're touching the same planet that I'm touching. So we are touching each other. Not in a weird way. Maybe not in a weird way. But you know what I mean? Like, we are connected, right? But it isn't actually that straightforward or simple. It's not like I can open my door and just go out and say hi and like shake your hand. I think it's the same for many people, many teams and organizations. So yes, it is possible to connect people to a higher level purpose, but there are many organizational contexts where achieving that isn't going to be possible. It's not going to be feasible, is it? Let's be honest, because the leadership in the organization are not incentivized for thinking in that way. They have never thought that way. If you have and I'm talking from experience on both sides of this, right? Where we have connected, and where it's been almost impossible to connect stuff because the people that are leading those specific functions aren't rewarded in solving the real business problem. They're rewarded for the size of their team or hitting a roadmap that they made up 18 months ago. You see what I mean? It's like there's some obvious stuff that maybe we need to highlight to say, yes, it is possible to do that, but in order to do that, we need to have these things in place.
Yeah. But if I'm completely honest, like, from that point of view, I believe that this is mostly a weakness on the strategic side. Mm-hmm. My point is, if you think about, what OKRs are and what strategy is, this is meant to be, right, a description of the value chain, if you think about it that way, or at the end of the day, something that gives you common objectives, right? So if you have a framework that gives you very clearly, these are the common objectives, we are all supposed to, based on our respective skill sets, right? But we're all supposed to contribute towards, that first strong first degree would make sure that the second degree that you described, which is potentially the operational incentivization of, like what people are driven by or just the revenue for, salesperson, all these kind of things. And the third degree that you're also describing, implicitly, which is like, people's egos and, like the desire for progress and everything. I think that what the problem is, we are too weak on the first degree to the point that, it's almost like the first degree should be 60%. And then the second degree should be 30% as a reinforcement mechanism, right? If I have the right incentive to reinforce what I'm trying to get to in the first place. And then the third degree, we would basically, be able to have a much better second degree. And the third degree would be contained to what it can be in a way. Like you can allow people to have ego and ambition and potentially do scheming if the remaining 90% is solid, right? But the problem is we start from a place where that 60% is like 10%. So in reality, you're left with like 10, 30, and 10. So suddenly, ego balances, the strategy itself. And then you have 30% in the middle of the wrong operationalization of the incentives. And so this is why we're in that situation. And that's why I really want to make sure that, the 80% is the conversation that is the healthy conversation. That's what we're all trying to do, right? The goal is, for example, for us to have, product to market fit. Imagine if you're a startup, early product market fit, in the specific conditions, that product with that market. Great. Below that, you have product and go to market motion as a strategy, right? Like our strategy is to create a product and take it to market, right? Just by saying that, you're basically declaring your strategies, but they all fit into the same objective. So necessarily, how could it be, back to your point, that you have sometimes such disconnects between the CRO, the CMO, the CPO, and, in the leadership team? This is what I thought was always crazy, right? But I think it's because at the heart, we don't put in the first degree the fact that, it is a team exercise. And that's because people, we never show them how it is that they connect together. Right? It's almost like, and I think we have oversimplified, right? People like things that are simple, but it's almost like, this very vertical, very simple layered kind of approach where it's like almost like throw it over the fence, right? Like the tech guys do it and then they throw it over the fence to the product or design guys. They throw it over the fence to the marketing guys. They throw it over the fence but if you keep doing it that way and you oversimplify, right? I think you are missing something. And I think this is the change I have, which is I get the fact that a lot of people want things that are super simple. The reality is always going to be more complex. The point is, at which degree of complexity do you need to get to in order to solve the problem? Mm-hmm. Because clearly making it too simple hasn't solved the problem, right? No. So it's missing that core understanding of how it is that, product and marketing and all the different functions contribute to that, contribute ultimately to the company objectives.
Which I didn't an exercise where quite recently I was with a client and I had supported some people in learning about OKRs and they had a good appreciation of it, and I gave them some OKRs to critique and they found it very difficult. And they could go back and say, they could ask those questions and they could see that maybe it was a bit too output focused and it wasn't really talking about behavior change, et cetera, but they still found it very difficult and they weren't happy with the feedback they were coming up. Next time round, I gave them a case study of a really clearly laid out strategy, which articulated what particular users they wanted to focus on, why they're focusing on those users, what types of problems those users had, how their products relate to those users. And then, by articulating effectively what the aspiration was for the organization, where they were looking to focus, what problems they were looking to solve, like what capabilities they had to then try and overcome those problems. And then they had some OKRs to critique.
Yes.
It was like night and day.
I mean,
It was night and day, because they could look through those OKRs and say, well, that one's rubbish and that one's rubbish because it does not speak to this, and this. This one actually really is a clear line between what they're trying to achieve at their strategy and what's written down. And they were able to provide feedback upon that one that was decent, which was a 100 times better quality feedback than when they were trying to do it when it was without that extra groundwork. But you say 60%, I would say that it's 90%. That strategic work is 90% of the work, because from that, everything else can fall out of it when you've got that. And when if people are wondering, well, OKRs are dead in my organization, it's always so much effort, it's always so hard. I'm reasonably certain a lot of that is because actually they don't really know what problem it is they're trying to solve.
Correct. And I think it hints at a much bigger problem in a way, like we were talking about, I think hell is paved with good intentions, right? Like, I think the worst hell that you live in is the one where it's just a perversion of something that started, well. And one such perversion is the fact that, we are very execution biased, right? And again, I think and I say that as in, if I call it crafting versus execution, right? If I make a cliche of the life cycle of a strategy, right? It starts with crafting the strategy. And then you deploy it, it has its life, you might sunset it, right? Like any other object in a way. But I think the problem is we don't do enough effort into the crafting. That part of the crafting is the key part. That's what I was trying to say, like in a simpler way with the vision, right? If you think about the vision, it cannot be a one-liner or one paragraph, because, you wouldn't expect to go to a pre-seed meeting, ask for $1 million with one slide, having one line. Correct. So even a vision requires you to have a lot more insight. And that's before you have even built anything. And that's what I mean by the crafting. So at that point, actually, if you look at the key slides that normally go into these kind of decks, you have identified the problem. You have identified the market, which is a way to say all the people that experience that problem. Right. You have formulated a view as to what you think the solution would be. You have had to look at the competition, therefore look at your differentiation. You have thought about things like moat and monetization and all these kind of things, right? So that on the back of all of that, you can then properly drive the strategy, right? This is what will inform how you're going to go into your market. Are you going to start SMB or enterprise? Are you going to start Europe or US? Are you going to start so that evolution, right? This is what leads ultimately to missions. My point is all that thinking happens upstream before you have even formalized things, right? And I think this is where we have the biggest gap. This is why people say most of the time, you don't have a strategy, because most of the time there's already something existing and you take it for granted and you don't question things. But if you don't have that, upstream part, you are really running blind, or definitely you have a few elements, but you need to actually be doing a much better job at that. Why is that? Because this is what's going to drive your experiment. And strategy, in many ways, is an assumption that, a specific way of doing things is going to lead to better outcomes, right? So if you don't have that part, then you're really screwed up, right? And I think most of the time, this is where you have the weakest link, let alone the fact that I think we don't have that, and then we don't have a good way to talk about it, right? Because one is maybe you're missing the diagnostics, you're missing everything I've been talking about, but then you have, what people talk about, the buy-in or, the alignment, all this kind of thing. So you have to have a way to easily explain, this is what I'm going to do, right? And I think this is again, where simple things like for example, I think about key results as goals, as a way to keep it simple, but more importantly as ABCDs, right? Actions, benefits, constraints, and detractors, like risks. Right? If you have something like that, again, it's like what you were saying, the kind of tips that are, tips as a way to help people remember what they should be thinking about. But actually more than that, they are actually a way to describe the strategy with all the core dimensions, right? Because, for example, people talk about risk versus reward profile. Yeah, but where are those boxes? Where do I find them? Whereas if you have the ABCD, you can say, well, my rewards are the benefits, the detractors are my risks. Right? What is my key conversion of output into outcomes? It's basically from the action to the benefits. What are the constraints in the sense of the optimization I'm supposed to abide by in terms of budget, lead time, whatnot? It's in there. Then you can have that conversation. And that's the point, which is also another topic that, is very interesting, is then prioritization. Right? Because you're trying to compare two different strategies, but they involve a very different set of actions, potentially. They can lead to very different benefits. They are under very different constraints, right? And the risks are very different, especially over time. Right? So like you would need to get that understanding in order to compare two strategies and decide which one is the most important. Like, and so that's my point. It's like, because we keep it too first degree, there's also a danger that oversimplifying, kind of obscure the picture in many ways.
Yeah, no, so much to unpack. And we are rapidly running out of time as well. So let's just point that out. So we're going to have to start wrapping up soon. But I was thinking as you were talking, and this idea that OKRs are dead, in the same way that everyone says that Agile is dead. And do you know what I think? If I draw a parallel between the two, I think that the OKR and particularly the Agile commercial complex, right? The industry that's created around Agile, and I think and people have tried to create similar industries around OKRs to kind of sell it. And I think actually what should die is the marketing on this simplicity premise. Is because OKRs are simple. Yeah, sure, OKRs are simple. Like they're easy to understand. That knowledge is not a hard one to attain. However, what is difficult is in making them effective when there is when you are bereft of strategy, when you're bereft of problem role, when the hard work, the groundwork, the foundation, that 60 to 90% of what will make your organization tick isn't there, then actually OKRs, they won't work. And I wonder, so many of the people that sold Agile over the years, and I'm talking from my own first-hand experience. I don't know if it's the same in the OKR world or not, but none of them have run a business. None of them have held senior positions in organizations. None of them understood strategy. None of them knew the hard yards of trying to make the difficult trade-offs to make a group or a function or a business successful. And so when they were going in and providing the advice, it fell flat and didn't make a difference because they didn't really understand how it all worked. And I think this is what we're saying here, is that OKRs will die and they won't work in an organization if you haven't got people that really understand how that business is running, and then how it could be running, and what's that strategic void that needs to be filled to make OKRs simple. Because ultimately, unless that strategic void is filled, OKRs will be challenging and they will end up just giving you more or less the same that you've got, but you'll be, maybe 5 to 6 figures lighter because you paid for loads of training and other bullshit you didn't really need.
Yeah, I mean, also a lot to impact there. I think, the industry is doing the best it can with what it has, right? And in many ways today, you have either very expensive, consultants or that provide a lack of continuity in many ways. Or you have, to do the training internally, and that takes time, and, this is not necessarily super efficient. And so, and you have solution providers who are also like thinking, look, this is the best thing that we have available at the moment, right? We need to offer it. And there's definitely gains to be had by having an OKR platform versus, doing OKRs in a spreadsheet or doing it by hand or whatever, right? And having OKRs is better than not having anything, right? But the point is more like, again, I'm all about outcomes in the sense like, does it solve the problem, right? If you just look at the result, look at the state of the companies and the moves they make and the alignment and the silos that you were talking about, the painful process, the endless hours of meetings leading to nothing. I mean, and that is like the thing that kills me. And I do mean that, right? You have great people and you have great companies that die from bad strategy management. I don't necessarily mean like there isn't a market or, it was the wrong strategy, but just even the operationalization of the strategy, like the way people think about things, like it's just wrong. And that is really killing companies. And the problem is like, as it's, impacting the company, really what you're saying is it's actually impacting the people, right? You're the one losing time. You're the one being frustrated. You're the one not knowing. So you're going to hide that you don't know what you're talking about. You're going to do your best. You just do it because someone asked you to do it. The point is like, this is a missed opportunity that is absolutely huge, right? And if you think about like, again, as a founder, you always think like the first employees, right? What triggers the decision? You have extra leverage, right? Like you can actually go faster as a company, do things better. You get your first, 5 employees. It's the same at 500. The point is like those people are there so they can give you the extra leverage, right? But you need to invest in accordingly to enable the people to do a great job.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're just diminishing returns.
Yes.
You spend more and more and get less and less and less.
And I think, to be honest, like something that I know it's also one of those very loaded words, but that's why I call strategic debt. Right? If you think about it, like most founders, right, just are, specialist of one thing. They might most of the time have not run a business before, nor a startup, nor anything like that. And they don't necessarily have an MBA. And even though an MBA is not necessarily a good way to get to strategy, but you know what I mean? The point is like, they're just going to make it happen organically, right? And it's going to keep growing. And the point is, like, it gets to some point where the day of reckoning comes, right? Like, you have that misalignment and you don't understand it, but that's because you have accumulated all that strategic debt.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it's all the hours you're not spending, because, you know, I see on LinkedIn or wherever all those posts where you see like this theoretical split of your time from being a product manager to a head of product, you know, director, VP and CPO. And somehow, you know, you magically go from spending 80% of your time on operational work, which is the reality when you're a PM, to, you know, spending 80% on your strategy, or 50, whatever it might be, when you are a CPO. The reality is like, it's not like that. Absolutely not. And that's the problem, right? Like, how much of our time, and I say that, you know, as a way to change the whole like leadership community, how much of our time are we really truly spending, you know, getting better at strategy, thinking about strategy, getting insights, and understanding the moves you could be making, as you were saying before, like deciding which one is the best move and for, you know, for what reason behind it, you know, making sure your organization is aligned, all these kind of things. Like, we barely spend any time, and the rituals we have today and the methodologies we have today don't necessarily drive towards, you know, doing a better job at that. And I think this is also why the AI is going to be so important, right? As a way to bridge that gap between the fact that people have so little time, so little support and enablement, despite all the best efforts of the companies, to actually become better. And the only way to do that sort of, you know, grand split is actually having the AI being there with you 24/7 in order to really ask the right questions. So you need to have the right framework as well as a way to structure that thinking, right? You need to be able to have the conversation we're having before, like the market and the problem, for example. Have you ever seen a strategy tool that shows you the market?
No.
But we agree that at the heart of it, strategy is a mean to change your business in order to impact your market. So you need 3 boxes, and yet you only ever model 1 box. That's what Stratify is supposed to resolve. Like, bring into one place everything within the 10%, right? You don't need the 90% of operationalization, but all the elements that you need in order to do a good job at strategy. And I think there's plenty of things that are currently missing, which means that I say as a joke often that, you know, it's like trying to be the team principal of a Formula One team. You can see the driver, but you can't see the car, or you can't see the circuit. This is insane, but this is the reality of what we're doing today, because we're trying to do strategy without seeing the business. Where is it modeled? Somewhere, some spreadsheet, some PowerPoint, some Miro, whatever. And then without ever seeing the market, where is it? Some marketing presentation, some CRM, whatever. But when you're having the strategic conversation, leadership team or everywhere, you should have all that environment around you in order for you to know what it is that you should be changing internally in order to get a change in behavior of the right type on the outside. And those simple things that I say that, like, that sounds very theoretical, right? But let me just, you know, bring it back to OKRs. When you were saying earlier, like, how do you test that, you know, an OKR is a good OKR? A way to test a good objective is if it's in your control or not. Because if it's an outcome, like people say, you know, like OKR should be outcome driven, it means that your objective should be in your market. And that's how you test, because if it's outside of you, it's not in your control, right? So that's why you say, for example, a good objective would be, I want to, you know, have more adoption from that user category on that specific product. You cannot guarantee that. It depends on the person on the outside to actually, you know, behave and do the change in behavior in order to get to what you want. And if they do that, then you will incur the benefit that you were trying to get to. Mm-hmm. Right? So this fundamental understanding is actually very much conditioned, you know, even like the way that, you know, any team is thinking about doing their own OKRs, let alone company strategy and everything else. Right?
Nice. So I want to leave it there. Only because it's like, it's nice. It's a nice way to end it. A high energy. I feel there's a lot of things we could talk about, and I think you should come back on when your products.
Yeah, happy to.
And we should dissect it a bit more, because it's really interesting, you know. And I think it's yeah, I like all the episodes that I record, but I think when we talk about strategy, and when we really talk about strategy and what it is and the links that it makes and all the great points you were making, you know. Just, you know, really understanding where you're going to play and how you're going to win, to kind of borrow phrases from someone else, you know. I think it's so critically important. And I think that something you mentioned as well, which I just want to say, my favorite way of doing all of these things is when it's an evolution and when people come to their own conclusions. And OKRs can be a great way to begin some of the shift in thinking towards considering outcomes. And then over time, if they then realize that actually there's a huge amount of strategic work to do, there's no point in kind of pushing OKRs much farther ahead until they get some of that foundation in place. And then I think you're on your way to a winner. If then people realize that actually the organizational structure and the operating model need to evolve somewhat to mean you can effectively begin to try and execute upon some of your strategic ideas, then all the better. But I think there's a lot of great work to do out there with a lot of great companies, and I don't think that Seb, you or I will ever be too short of work.
No, and I think, look, in many ways, I think it's also where the opportunity lies, right? Like, we talk about the link between problems and opportunity. I think the problem itself is so complex, as you were saying. It's very multifaceted. It has many different layers. Where, like, we're talking about ego, we're talking about process. We haven't talked about data, by the way. There's a lot of things like, we talked about strategy, we talked about culture, innovation, impact on the company. The problem is very complex, and I think, again, like, I think that there is value in trying to be a bit more thoughtful and a bit more in depth in those reflections, because the product itself is going to be necessarily more complicated, but then you're going to know that you are having the right conversation, and that's the only thing I care about, right? It's like, and I think you can break it down into little conversations, like smaller bits, but the point is, like, you just need to make sure that quality of conversation is as high as possible, right? And so I think this is why I think nobody has done it before. Because, you've had people doing, I'm modeling your business, so I'm giving you a generic tool, or I have ChatGPT, or I have all these things, but like nothing has been really taking on the whole problem of strategy. And this is why a platform just for OKRs is minute when you compare it to the whole industry of, business consulting and strategy management consulting. And it's taken an army the last 3 decades to make it into what it is today. The point is, can you actually get the best of those two worlds? Can you even combine them, which is what I'm really thinking about? But, have a platform that is that much more powerful as a way to simplify, as a way to give you the insights and everything, but gives you the best, again, like the golden top of the pyramid. Yes, then you can have the consulting in terms of, okay, what move should I make? Where am I going wrong with my diagnostic? Is that is really added value. But if you think about most of the time, like, what you're really saying when you're paying consultants, whatever, is you're reverse engineering your business model. You're redefining your market. And that's the problem with continuity, because you should have that information before. You should have that conversation while you're having it with the consultant, and you should have it after, once they left. Right? So the point is, like, you need to have that almost like super tool in order to drive everything else. Because that's the thing. Every company, even a startup, has, 15 to 20 different tools, CRMs, HR, everything you think about. What system drives those things? Because if you're truly saying that management is driving the company as an organization and process, then there should be a tool that reflects that. Right? And at the moment, if you think about it, part of the problem in the ecosystem of enterprise systems is that you don't have that orchestrator, if you think about it that way, that, is that 10% of the iceberg that actually coordinates things, that is able to take data from the operational system, but is also able to send definitions. Because that's the thing. For example, when you're saying ICP, the ICP is operationalized in your CRM, right? There's a questionnaire that a salesperson is going to go to the customer and ask and say, okay, what's your profile? Where does it come from? It's actually a strategic decision, right? So you need something like, at the moment we are putting it in a spread, in a slide somewhere, and hoping it makes its way into the CRM. Actually, it should be something that is more like, hard facts. We are committing to that ICP because we believe in that vision. We believe it's going to be more efficient. They feel more the pain. There's a bigger market behind it and all these things. Once you have that, then you have a healthy conversation.
Yeah. And if it means there's one less PowerPoint slide in the world, I don't mind about that.
Please, a zillion. I mean, I'd like everything. When I say everything, and this is more like a sort of principle or, like something lofty and aspirational, but I truly believe in it from a product strategy point of view, to have everything in the tool. Right? So if the tool is about strategic conversations, why not have the conversations directly in the tool?
Yeah, no. I said, well, I look forward to the demo.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Let me know when your website's live, and I'll book my free demo. So thank you so much for a passionate conversation, one which I think, it was good. I think about really important stuff. And listeners, I hope that you've got something from this, because I don't think that enough. I don't know. I don't think there's ever enough said about really what a strategy is and helping people realize how it manifests and its criticality to so much about what we do. And I think there's always a bridge for me to be built over the void of misunderstanding and just having the knowledge. So Seb, thank you for coming on and bringing your skills and your knowledge and your stories and your experience. If people want to get in contact with you, they can do so via LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's definitely the easiest. Reach out to me. I'm still the kind of person that doesn't require an email for us to connect, and you can, if you ping me, I'll reply back as well.
Well, get on the internet, people. Go to LinkedIn, find Seb. We'll put his LinkedIn profile into the show notes and drop him a message. Say hello, ask him a question, challenge him on something. But this podcast exists to connect you, our listeners, to awesome people like Seb. So please do take up this opportunity. As I said, Seb, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything you want to share before we wrap up?
No, I think stratify.me is the name of the website. It has a very basic page at the moment, but the proper version is coming very soon with the product in beta by the end of the quarter if everything goes well and according to the roadmap. So stay tuned.
And when do things ever not happen as per the roadmap, Seb? I mean, that's unheard of.
That's a whole new podcast.
Excellent. Okay, everyone head over to stratify.me. We'll put a link in the show notes as well. And everyone, thank you very much for listening. We'll be back probably this time next week. So every Thursday morning, we're here delivering you with some excellent insights, some of the world's best and most interesting people in product and agile. So do make sure that you subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll speak to you all again next week.